Chapter 26. Trabia Garden. Deep in the northern mountains, well and truly isolated from the rest of the world, Trabia Garden hid itself away from the general hustle and bustle of the other nations. The country of Trabia had no real cities to speak of, and instead isolated, small tribes and villages were spread out across the snowy, mountainous landscape at random intervals. It was the first time Squall had ever been so far north. Everyone in the garden had broken out their winter clothes as they reached the chilly region. But Squall, with Shiva attached in his head, couldn't get enough of it. Standing out on the second-floor balcony, he watched the mountains and forest fly past and around him as the cold northern winds whipped at his hair. He had taken off his jacket to allow his limbs to enjoy the sensations. In his head, Shiva was practically purring in delight. She didn't need to coat his body in cold magic today because the landscape was exactly to her preference. While everyone else was wearing thick coats and trying to heat the inside of the garden, Squall had taken to spending a great portion of his day out here. At least, the times that he could spare. The trip to Trabia took longer than the day-long return to Balam. The distance itself was daunting, but no one had traveled this way in a long time. They had to alternate between nautical maps and ground maps and try to recognize landmarks made for people not flying on a large garden. And since Nita was the only one qualified to fly the garden, Squall was thinking of assigning him an apprentice cadet or seat of some sort. They could only move while he was awake and at the controls. They had finally risen from the water this morning. They were trekking rather slowly through the area, trying to locate Trabia around the mountains it was settled into. All totaled, they had been traveling to Trabia for 4 days now. And that gave Squall plenty of time to be inundated into his new role as commander and all that entailed. Squall always knew he would likely be called upon to give instruction to cadets training with the gunblade. He was the only gunblade specialist, after all. So Quistis asking him to begin demonstrations since he had little else to do now wasn't so onerous. There was an increase in gunblade perspectives now that someone had actually made it and then been promoted to commander. That alone would have kept him busy. He wasn't a full-time instructor, he didn't even have a license, but he was dedicated to whatever he was doing. However, he also got to experience the joy of being the one that received reports from the many seeds that they had picked up near Balam. Sue had taken most of them as ordered, but they had still needed to be given to him. He had also started training Renoa in earnest. There were no opportunities for them to stumble upon monsters to fight out here, so she had been getting antsy. When she came to ask if he would take her into the training center and teach her more formally, he hadn't been able to refuse. Added to that, Irvine had come to him asking if he could start the process to join SEED. That hadn't been his intention when he had been at Galbadia Garden. He had merely been coasting along there, probably fated for the G Army or just being a dropout. Now that he was here, however, now that he had friends here and he could see just how useless the G Army was, not to mention not wanting to be a sorceress's puppet, he had changed his mind about career paths. So Squall had needed to see to getting Irvine into the sharpshooter program here. Which, according to Irvine, was not only miles ahead of Galbadia Garden but filled with much nicer people. He wanted to take his written test quickly. Which brought to Squall's attention a problem that he didn't realize being commander would entail. He supposed it should have been obvious. As SEED commander, he was now in charge of the SEED exam. Sue was there to help him as the official administrator of the garden. She happily explained the normal parameters of conducting and grading the exam and examinees. Squall's mass exam was actually an exception rather than the rule of typical SEED exams. Normally, such exams rarely involved more than 1 or 2 cadets. The long list of cadets wanting to take the exam, however, never stopped growing. Which was a problem because, now that they were moving and not taking on hiring requests at the moment, there were no opportunities to send people on exams. So he and Sue were considering their options, including alternative methods for examination that wouldn't involve a real mission. Though neither of them were inclined to take that route, as SEED was a mercenary group and the importance of the exam being a real mission couldn't be overstated. With everything going on, the bulk of his free time that he spent out here on the balcony enjoying the cold was actually whittled down to about an hour or so. Maybe. Usually later in the day when it really got cold. That only made it better though. The wind calmed his mind slightly. The beautiful scenery caught and kept his attention so he couldn't lose himself to his own nagging thoughts. And the lack of anyone else wanting to brave the cold meant he could be alone. The groaning of metal of the door had him turning to see Rinoa stepping outside. She started shivering immediately at the cold air, despite the fact that she had winter-proofed her clothes. She, or maybe someone else, had added a fur hood to her duster and fur lining to her arm sleeves. She wore black leggings now to protect her legs and the ends of her duster had been lined in fur. It was an alteration on her own clothing designed for the new terrain.
Like it?
She asked, turning for his benefit.
Quistis and Selfie and I spent all last night making our clothes warm. It was really easy for Quistis, admittedly. I had no idea sewing was such an integral part of being SEED. Adapting your clothing to your environment is important,
Squall said.
As is making sure that, despite any alterations, you can still fight in what you wear.
Rinoa walked to the railing and smiled at him.
Nice view.
Rinoa found it funny that now was when he removed his jacket. He didn't appear the slightest bit cold either. As she stood next to him, Rinoa felt the chill in the air elevate. Shiva's power reached out as she stood next to Squall and wrapped her up in air that pushed away the cold and let her feel warmth. Shiva couldn't make her survive in the cold, not without being in Rinoa's head, but she could keep her from freezing by removing the own cold from her. Squall kept to himself that that's what his GF was doing. He didn't know if Rinoa knew what was going on, but she clearly understood that she was warmer than she should be. He just didn't want to break open that conversation. Rinoa smiled and leaned her arm against his.
Do you want to be alone? Not particularly.
He did, actually. Away from everyone but her. Rinoa was the exception. He didn't seem to ever mind when she was right there next to him. What was wrong with him?
Are we very far away now?
Rinoa asked curiously, looking down to the dark green, snow-coated forest they were currently passing over.
Hard to say. Selfie is helping Nita navigate, but there's a big difference in travel methods. She's never seen the terrain from this height. I thought you were training cadets this morning. I was supposed to. Quistis wanted to have a special ice monster class though. She asked me yesterday to allow the cadets and SEEDs to leave the garden when we arrive to do some hunting and training around the mountain area. I said yes, so she's arranged lecture about fighting ice monsters. Is she teaching it? No, just organizing. Quistis lost her instructor's license. Oh. Well, can't you just give it back to her? I'm the commander, that doesn't fall under my jurisdiction. Issuing instructor's licenses falls to Sue. And she won't do it because it was Headmaster Sid that revoked the license in the first place.
Rinoa hummed thoughtfully.
Have you ever considered getting your instructor's license? No. Why not?
Squall didn't answer immediately. Rinoa waited patiently. Since she had asked him to open up to her, he had answered all of her questions. However, it wasn't always immediately. There were times when he had to think about it first. He would answer eventually, she just had to wait for him to get his thoughts in order to do so.
I guess I didn't want the responsibility.
Rinoa laughed.
That worked out well for you.
Squall agreed sardonically. In his efforts to escape a classroom responsibility, he had somehow walked into responsibility over everyone here.
For what it's worth, I think you're a great teacher,
Rinoa beamed at him.
And I'm not even biased by the fact that you're really the only combat teacher I've ever had. I see how you teach the cadets. You're really good.
Squall shrugged.
I'm probably not personable enough. Well, yeah. You're a bit lacking in that area. But you're attentive and you're good at explaining things. You know, I bet you would make a really good father too. What?
Squall started, looking over to her quickly. Rinoa laughed.
Relax, I'm not saying you should become one now. I'm saying that, for future reference, you would probably be a good parent. Pretty sure I'm not personable enough for that either,
Squall muttered. Kids? Yeah, no. There was no way he should be entrusted with younglings. He didn't even want to get involved with the underclassmen here.
Yeah, but you're responsible. And understanding. And dedicated. And you don't run from your problem no matter how hard it gets. You may resent it, but you still do it. I bet you would be one of those parents that reads all the books and does all the research and has just stacks of notes for how to raise and care for children.
Squall opened his mouth but couldn't really deny that. He probably would. He asked instead,
why are we having this conversation?
Rinoa shrugged.
I think it's the cold. Makes me want to hole up inside with someone warm. Really kicks in the nesting instincts, you know.
Squall shrugged because, honestly, he didn't.
Relax,
she said again, leaning against his shoulder.
It's just a thought. I imagine kids, if you have any, are going to be well down the line for you.
Especially if she was the one having them, she thought to herself. There was no way she was going to get pregnant as a teenager. Squall looked at her for a long moment. Her head on his shoulder, her eyes drifting shut, and he tried really, really hard to not think about Rinoa and kids. Because that made him think about Rinoa being pregnant. And that made him think about how she would get pregnant. And if he dared open that box again, he was going to need Shiva to douse him in ice. They stayed that way, just watching the scenery and enjoying each other's presence, until Nita came over the intercom to ask Squall to return to the bridge.
Can I go down with you?
Rinoa asked, as they stepped back.
I'd like to be there. For selfie. If I can.
Squall nodded his permission and led her back up to the bridge. Selfie was already there, practically twitching. She had seen it coming around the mountain range on the bridge, but she had ran before she could actually see it. She felt slightly cowardly for refusing to look, but she just couldn't. Selfie had winter-proofed her dress as well. Meaning she had stolen Irvine's trench coat and had thrown it over herself. It kind of drowned her tiny frame, but she wasn't giving it back. Mostly because it was fun for her to see Irvine running around looking for it wearing that purple vest of his and nothing else to cover his arms and chest.
Come on, Squall,
she said, rolling up the sleeves on the coat. It dragged behind her slightly, and the sleeves could not possibly allow for her to fight. But it was warm. And it felt like she was getting a really big hug from Irvine. And she felt like she would need that right now.
Hold on,
Squall told her calmly before riding up the platform to join Nita.
Where is it? There,
Nita pointed just ahead of them. Balam Garden was already coming to a halt in front of what could only be described as the ruins of Trabia Garden.
Damn,
Squall mumbled at the sight of it, trying to lower his voice so Selfie wouldn't hear.
All right. I'm going down with Rinoa and Selfie to make contact. I want you to call for Quistis, Zell, and Irvine to come back us up. If there are survivors, they'll likely be injured. So I want you to put Drive Katawaki on standby. If she doesn't just go down herself,
Nita grinned. Squall nodded, agreeing.
Tell the students that they're allowed to go out to hunt the monsters in the region if they wish, but to follow the lessons they learned earlier today in the seminar. No one goes out alone. Period. And everyone must be back on the garden by sundown. Commander,
Nita grinned.
You know you're allowed to use the mic yourself, right? Just make the announcement,
Squall grumbled, turning from Nita as he laughed. Squall rode back down to join Rinoa and Selfie, the latter of whom looked ready to burst with restrained impatience to get out of here.
Come on,
she said, motioning towards the elevator. She continued to twitch in the elevator. However, as they started down towards the front gates, she hesitated and looked like she might be sick. Squall had to wait while Rinoa put her arms around her shoulders and gently coaxed her forward. Selfie wanted to see. She didn't want to see. She had to know. She couldn't handle the truth. It was a war of conflicting emotions that left her feeling nauseated and confused. But she allowed Rinoa to gently guide her forward and looked to Squall's stoic facade and demeanor for strength. He was like a rock, so steady and reliable. She had to use that right now. Selfie took deep breaths while they rode down the lift. When they hit the ground, she could no longer put it off. She finally raised her eyes to look at Trabia Garden. Pale gold, light blue, and a dusty sort of brown were the colors Trabia had chosen to use. The ring that floated over their heads, marking them as an old shelter, had used to shine brightly like sunshine on snow. The ring had snapped in half. One half had crashed to the ground, leaving the other half to remain over the garden. But the shine was gone. It was dark, dull, and dead. Selfie didn't need to know anything about the technology that moved the garden to tell that this one was beyond repair. She ran now towards the front gates. They were lopsided from how she remembered. Everything was quiet and closed off. Those gates didn't normally close. The crumbling remains of the garden, that Selfie had always thought looked like a pretty cake, vanished as she walked under the shadow of the closed gates.
A direct hit,
Selfie moaned, her shoulders dropping. Of course it was. There had been nothing to protect them. No warning. No preemptive attempts to sabotage the launch. She knew that. She had always known that. But it seemed so much more awful to actually see it.
Terrible.
Rinoa breathed sadly. Selfie's jaw tightened and she turned back to Squall, her eyes hard.
I'm going in.
She wasn't asking, she was telling. Squall nodded.
Be careful.
Selfie turned quickly and grabbed for the vines with small green leaves overlaying the closed gate. It twisted all the way to the top and Selfie started climbing. The road, tilted and broken as it was, didn't look like it would allow the gate to open anymore. Squall heard her drop on the other side and sprint away just as Irvine cried out.
Squall!
He turned to see him running up. Without his coat, he looked rather cold. However, he didn't appear to miss it overly much at this moment.
"Where's Selfie?"
he asked, looking around.
"I let her go on ahead,"
he said. Irvine let out a breath as he and the others looked at the garden.
"I bet you she's in shock. Squall, let's go after her." "Do you think there are monsters around here?"
Rinoa asked, worried.
"Squall, I don't want to make her fight alone right now."
Squall nodded as he walked up to the gates. He grabbed onto the vines and started pulling himself up by the fistful. The tough little winter-growing plants were sturdy despite their thin size. Squall threw his leg over the top and dropped down onto the walkway. From this side of the gate, Trabia appeared even worse off. The path looked like it had survived an earthquake. Rocks had broken and pieces were pushing up into the sky. The plant life had been razed to ash and dirt. The school looked cold and abandoned. He heard Rinoa drop down beside him and, a moment later, Irvine joined them. He looked up and thought he could see, in the distance, Selfie running towards the school. Quistis Thenzel also came around from the gate. Squall let out a breath.
"All right, we're going after Selfie. Quistis, you and Zell scout the area. Irvine, you stay with Rinoa and I."
Irvine nodded thankfully as Quistis and Zell moved away to check around. Squall led Irvine and Rinoa forward, closer to the school. He really hoped that they wouldn't find monsters eating the remains of those who died here. He didn't think Selfie could handle that.
"Squall."
Rinoa breathed as they came in closer.
"Yeah. I see it."
Squall's face softened in relief. Selfie, a bright smile on her face and happy tears in her eyes, was jumping up and down, talking eagerly with a girl from Trabia Garden. The school, crumbling around them, was still providing shade and shelter for the few students and staff that moved about. Survivors. More than that, survivors that weren't in desperate need of assistance. As they came in closer, Selfie looked to him and her happy, relieved tears spilled over.
"Squall, this is my best friend. Look, she's alive." "Hello,"
the young lady nodded to Squall. She looked a little like she hadn't had enough food lately and had lost weight, but her eyes were bright and healthy.
"Nice to meet you."
Squall nodded, returning the sentiment silently.
"I have to admit, I was worried when Selfie transferred to Balam," she continued. "But you look like you've been taking care of her pretty well there. Thank you for looking after her."
Squall's eyes moved over to Selfie, who was staring at her friend, just happy to see she had survived, then back again. He could feel Rinoa looking at him, waiting. "Oh, why not play along?"
"Selfie's been a great help to us,"
he said as warmly as he was able. It sounded a little stiff. Selfie gasped loudly, her hands slapping over her mouth in surprise. Squall frowned at her while Rinoa giggled. Selfie's friend frowned at Selfie as well.
"What's wrong?" "That's not like Squall at all."
Selfie squealed, looking like she might cry again. Squall sighed and rolled his eyes up. "See, this is why he didn't do things like this." Rinoa's hand on the back of his arm was her way of telling him that, despite the reaction, he had done well. That would have to be enough for now.
"Squall, there's a basketball court out back,"
Selfie smiled.
"Can you go wait there for me? I want to check in and catch up with a few more people."
Squall nodded and turned to leave and allow her the moment. Irvine let out a breath of relief as they walked away.
"I'm glad." Yet,
Rinoa nodded, agreeing happily.
Look at all the people that survived. That's still not the total population of this garden,
Squall said softly.
There should be far more people here. There were losses when the missiles hit.
Rinoa frowned as Irvine sighed. It was just the truth though, and they couldn't deny it. However, that there were any people was a miracle. Despite the sadness all around them, despite the building that was crumbling behind them, the air of the garden seemed strangely upbeat. They passed a professor who asked them if they had done a good deed for their garden today. Then later a guy dreaming with his mouth half open about a triple triad game that he was apparently winning with gusto. They came around to one of the few covered parts of the building and they saw two girls going over supplies and budgets. In the corner of that same room, they saw two members of the tech squad trying to return life to the downed electrical system. They didn't appear to be doing all that bad of a job either. Everywhere Squall looked, he saw only life and hope. The people of Trabia Garden were so different from both Balam and Galbadia Gardens. Despite the destruction around them, these people were still doing their best to live.
I like it here,
Rinoa smiled around at them all.
It certainly explains selfie,
Irvine grinned, tipping his hat. As they were leaving that place, they saw Selfie tucking a sleeping guy into bed. Irvine frowned, but before he could ask what was up, two underclassmen were running up to her.
Selfie!
The boy yelled. It wasn't a happy call. The girl, nearly in tears, stopped in front of her and sniffed.
Can you forgive us?
Selfie started, confused.
What? Why? What do I need to forgive you for?
The boy looked so guilty as he dropped his eyes.
That teddy bear you gave me. I couldn't save it. I can hear him crying.
The girl exclaimed, tears falling from her own eyes.
He's lonely.
Selfie beamed at them and shook her head.
My teddy bear is a lot stronger than you think. As long as you're both safe, Mr. Bear is very happy.
Selfie paused, then cocked her head to the side, listening.
Heey. I can hear him too. Mr. Bear is watching over you secretly.
The two kids shared a wide-eyed look of amazement. Selfie nodded to them.
So you can't be sad or naughty, okay? Just remember, Mr. Bear is watching out for you.
The kids, tears still in their eyes, started laughing and smiling again. Selfie beamed at them, then turned her smile up over their heads to the three of them. She waved and pointed over her shoulder to where she wanted them to wait. Squall nodded and walked past the children who were promising to be good and happy.
That was sweet,
Rinoa said, dabbing at her eyes. Sweet, but so sad.
I can't believe the sorceress would do that to a couple of innocent kids. Kind of makes you wonder if what they say about sorceress power being corrupting is true,
Irvine sighed.
Or maybe Edia was like that all along,
Rinoa frowned.
Why is it that evil people always end up being sorceresses? I don't think that's true,
Irvine frowned.
It's probably because it's easy to just steal a sorceress's power,
Squall interjected.
All you have to do is kill one and be the closest female to her when she dies. Then her power becomes yours, right? Yet,
Rinoa sighed.
Kind of makes it difficult for good people to be sorceresses. So I guess, in a way, sorceress magic really is corrupting.
Irvine remained silent as they turned around a corner of the garden and came upon the dilapidated basketball court Selfie was talking about. The asphalt here had also been cracked and disturbed from its bed, but both hoops were still standing. Irvine, his head lowered, walked to one end of the court, keeping strangely to himself. Squall frowned at the action, reminded a little too much of the moment when he had started freaking out instead of taking the shot at Sorceress Edia. Rinoa smiled at Squall before moving over to the fence encircling the courtyard so she could look up at the mountains surrounding them. Though cold, Trabia really had beautiful scenery. Squall remained in place, looking up at the cloudy sky above them. He didn't really move again until he heard two sets of footsteps coming up from behind that he identified easily as Quistis and Zell. He turned to face them.
"Hey,"
Quistis smiled sadly.
"What's wrong?"
Rinoa asked, frowning at her expression.
"Oh, nothing. We just saw Selfie over by the graveyard."
Quistis forced a smile as Zell sighed sadly.
"Drive Katawaki came down and is coordinating with their medical doctor here. They're low on supplies, so we're sharing some of ours with them."
Squall,
Suze sent a message. "She says we're running low on supplies ourselves and we need to work out a way to resupply now with the garden moving."
Squall nodded.
"All right. We'll talk about it when we leave." "Which will be when?"
Zell asked. Squall crossed his arms, thinking. He really didn't want to leave the people of Trabia in this condition, but he couldn't deny that they were doing well on their own. And he had his own agenda to see to in order to ensure this didn't happen to anyone else.
"We'll get back on the garden as soon as Selfie comes back. We'll stay through the night to help the people here. We're on standby till then."
Standby. He was actually starting to look forward to the reprieves they gave him. Did that make him old and jaded already or just accustomed to them? Squall found himself looking up at the sky again as a host of thoughts and questions and plans ran around in his mind. Standby no longer meant twiddling his thumbs. Nowadays, it was more a chance to plan, reassess, and reconfigure. Rinoa smiled at the sight he made, highlighted against the bruised clouds in the sky. Arms crossed, eyes far away, the gears in his head running full speed ahead so loud she could hear them. Always on, always responsible. Probably planning strategy in fighting the sorceress. Then she frowned as an old memory, one she tried to repress, slammed into her. Squall, speared by ice, falling from a float and breaking his body against the hard concrete an eternity below. His blood pooling around him. That dead look in his eyes after he had been tortured. He was going to go fight the sorceress again. The same one that had nearly took him from Rinoa so recently. What if she lost him for real this time? They stayed there for a while, talking around Squall. Rinoa wasn't the only one that recognized his thinking face and they didn't attempt to pull him into the conversation. Irvine was being strangely quiet, probably worried about Selfie, Rinoa figured, so she, Quistis, and Zell talked around them about everything and nothing. The rubbery bouncing sound of a ball drew all their attention as the scuffed but still intact basketball rolled into the court. Selfie ran in after it. Her eyes were a little puffy and red, telling them that she had been crying, but the relieved, happy look on her face spoke volumes. Though it had hurt her to see so many she had known and loved killed, it had also healed that broken, tired part of her that had been worn down by simply not knowing.
"Sorry to keep you waiting."
Selfie smiled brightly, her eyes focusing mostly in Squall.
"Thanks so much for coming all the way out here, everyone. We're just happy you cheered up, Selfie,"
Irvine said, finally stepping back into the group.
"Thanks."
She smiled at him, then looked back at Squall. Her eyes hardened. He was reminded of that moment when she had first seen the missiles launch. That same, determined look was written there. No longer so playful or carefree.
Take me with you when you fight the sorceress, okay? I wanna get even. I want my revenge.
Squall nodded, accepting the request without complaint. Rinoa's soft voice didn't have to be loud for Squall to hear it. Her small, almost unheard sound had his eyes focusing on hers immediately. She had reached up to grab her necklace, like she was taking comfort from the single silver ring dangling there.
Do we?
She frowned at the ground.
Do we have to fight? Isn't there another way? You know, to avoid any bloodshed.
The seats in front of her stared. She made a face but didn't take it back.
Yo! What they?
Zell shook his head, like she had started speaking a foreign language and he couldn't understand her any longer.
What are you sayin' all of a sudden?
Rinoa bit her lip.
Maybe someone really smart can come up with a way. So we wouldn't have to fight anymore.
Her eyes lifted slowly, looking up to Squall almost hopefully and made him frown. What exactly was she getting at? Well, if someone could come up with something, that'd be great. Of course. But no one was doing anything. Everyone was scared. Uneasy. All anyone does is complain. They just pretend to be thinking while all they're doing is trembling. They criticize others for the lack they find in themselves and, in the end, they can't do anything either. Rinoa. Why was she asking this all of a sudden? What was she expecting of him now? He grew up in Balam Garden. He was a seed. A blood-bringer. As much as she had hated to hear it said, the simple fact was that he fought people for money. And this was no different. Didn't she understand that?
Squall.
Rinoa prompted, stepping forward slightly. She was smiling at him gently, sadly.
You have to voice your feelings, or else I won't understand.
Open up more. Talk to them. Right. Squall cast his mind around, trying to figure out how to say what he was thinking. Rinoa waited patiently as she had been doing for days now. Waited for him to get his ever-chaotic thoughts in order to provide a sufficient answer for her. The others looked between them, wondering if that simple statement would even work.
You were part of a resistance movement in Timber, right?
Squall finally asked, unsure of himself but still willing to try. For her.
Unlike others who were all talk, you took to your weapons and fought. And now you're saying you don't want to fight anymore? What happened to you?
He did. He happened. Then she had almost lost him to this very same fight.
I guess. I'm just scared.
She blew out a long breath. He was opening up to her. It was only fair, and encouraging, if she would do the same for him.
Sometimes, when I'm with all of you, I feel like we're on the same wavelength. You know what I mean? Like we're all friends. We're all equals. But when the battles start happening, it's different. Everyone's tempo seems to pick up and I get left behind.
Squall frowned. Left behind? Rinoa shook her head, her eyes closing, trying to shut out the emotions and memories that were nagging at her.
I try to catch up, but it's no use.
She let out a long breath and cast her eyes up to the sky.
How far is everyone going? I can't hear your voices anymore. I can't see you.
She lowered her head back to him, the sadness of her words reflected in her eyes.
And once I catch up, I wonder, is everyone safe? Will they welcome me with open arms? Is everyone okay? Will we all make it back together? Or will I lose you? And when I start thinking like that, I just...
Rinoa's voice tightened, cutting her off. Squall, dead. The others, gone. Her, all alone. Clinging desperately to all of them and trying to hold it together. Hold this improvised little seed family together despite the world trying to tear them apart.
Rinoa, I understand.
Rinoa jumped. She hadn't been expecting Irvine, of all people, to be the one to speak up. She had never heard that soft, caring tone from him before. Irvine stepped closer and smiled, his eyes sad and distant.
You get scared that someone might not be there. Someone you love may disappear before your very eyes and you'll be helpless to do anything about it. Irvine?
She breathed, surprised.
It's tough when you live your life thinking that way. But that very reason is why I fight in the first place. To protect my future. To preserve my past.
Irvine stopped for a moment, hesitating. His jaw moved up and down as if he was trying to move words past a numb throat. He looked over Rinoa's head for a second and she saw a decision cement in his strangely serious eyes.
When I was a little kid, I was about 4 or so. I was in an orphanage.
Irvine turned from her with a sad grin and picked up the basketball that Selphie had thrown into the court for them. He tossed it between his hands for a moment, thinking over his words. How to say what he had been dying to say for a long time now.
An orphanage?
Rinoa repeated, stepping up behind him.
Yup.
Irvine drew back his hand and shot the basketball from where he stood. It swooshed neatly through the ring, though there was no net any longer to slip through. The ball bounced against the broken ground and Irvine grinned.
I didn't know that.
Rinoa grabbed her elbows.
Why? Why was I there, or why am I telling you?
Irvine grinned at her.
Both, I guess.
He shrugged.
My parents. Well, I actually don't know for certain what happened to them. Honestly, record keeping wasn't a big deal back then. It was around the end of the Sorceress War. Esthar's tyrant had suddenly been deposed, countries were scrambling to get their own stuff in order again with the sudden pulling back of all of Esthar's troops. There were plenty of kids in the orphanage like me. Some lost their parents in battles, others in raids. We were the true casualties of war, innocent lives that didn't even really understand what was going on. Sorry, I think I'm making it sound worse than it really was. Yeah, I was an orphan, but it wasn't all bad. I had great caretakers that really cared about us and we were in a safe place that monsters didn't tend to visit. And I had a lot of siblings. A lot of friends. And, out of all the kids there, one was very special to me. Irvi, wanna play?
Irvine grinned, sliding his hands into his pants pockets. He could still see her face even now. Tiny, cherubic almost, yet so full of delightful mischief. He could see the way she would stand there, her hands pulled behind her back, her hair bouncing almost in defiance of gravity. In the old stone house, in the room where they all would congregate to have fun.
I really liked this girl, and it made me so happy just talking to her. Sephi, watcha playing. Heh. War.
Selphie frowned as the echoes of the past whispered in her mind. The laughter of a boy who never told her she was too wild or out of control. The cold of the stone floor that never seemed to be able to permeate through the warmth of the air. And, more than anything, the feeling of missing parents that she knew she'd never see again.
Was that orphanage an old stone house?
Selfie asked him as though confused at her own question. Irvine didn't appear at all surprised. If anything, he looked resigned.
You guessed it. An old house made of stone.
They all turned to Quistis as she frowned at the ground. That's right, there was a stone house. It used to smell like flowers. Monsters had always avoided that place for some reason, and it was the only time she had been able to sleep since seeing her parents devoured by the grand mantis that destroyed her life. The curtains over the windows. The warmth of the fireplace. The bite of golden sand on her bare feet as she played in the water.
By the ocean.
Quistis looked up, her eyes wide in her own realization.
You guessed it.
Irvine repeated, though they both knew it was no guess at all.
The orphanage closed down. Oh, probably about 10 years ago now. Maybe more. And we were all sent away to different locations. Some of us were adopted, others had nowhere else to go. I lost all my friends almost at the same time. I couldn't hear them, I couldn't see them. I couldn't know if they were okay. But when I saw you back in Galbadia Garden, I knew right away. Hey!
Selfie glared at him.
Why didn't you tell us? Yes, why didn't you tell us?
Quistis asked almost angrily.
'Cause you had forgotten.
Irvine exclaimed, throwing up his hands.
For a while, I thought I had just accidentally run into similar people with the same names and that I was still reaching out for a past that would never exist again. I thought I was going crazy. Then. I don't know. I guess I just kind of felt bad. It just kinda sucked that I was the only one who remembered. Spunky little Seffi and bossy little Quisty. That is just so weird.
Selfie laughed.
It's like the best coincidence ever. Hey,
Zell grinned, looking up suddenly.
Do you guys remember setting off fireworks?
Selfie and Quistis's eyes went wide, but Irvine nodded, once again unsurprised at all. Zell laughed as memories of sparklers and the cool night air hit him all at once. Like the memories had just been waiting for a chance to be recalled. The fear, the guilt, the righteous sense of right and wrong that he felt almost like he had been tricked into believing. On the beach.
Yeah.
Selfie laughed, nearly in tears as one memory set off another. With the cool air of the night wrapped around them as they tried to hide away from their caretakers and enjoy the goods they had stolen.
The ocean. The lighthouse.
Zell said, pointing like he could see it. Perched delicately at the end of the rocky cape. The constant spinning of the light had always been so memorizing. Zell used to like to pretend that the light was from an all-seeing eye that was watching over the house, keeping soldiers and monsters at bay.
We did set off fireworks,
Quistis laughed, suddenly euphoric. She had been the lookout while Selfie had used Irvine as a pack mule while stealing them.
Yo. Kids aren't supposed to play with fireworks. I'm telling. I'm gonna tell on you.
Zell frowned as he remembered his own, younger self. He had kind of been a prat. The others used to have a song. How did it go?
Cry ba by zell. Go back to bed.
Oh, yeah. He frowned as Quistis and Selfie laughed. Even Irvine, so uncharacteristically serious, was smiling between the two of them.
We all got in big trouble,
Quistis laughed. Zell grabbed his belly to laugh along with her. But, wait.
If I remember this,
Zell's brow furrowed.
Does that mean I was there, too?
Irvine nodded.
But then, what about my parents in Balam? The Dinchts must have adopted you,
Quistis said simply.
When the orphanage closed, we all had to go somewhere. I guess you were adopted out.
Yep, Irvine nodded.
You and Quistis and Selfie were all adopted. Sent away to Galbadia, Trabia, and Balam each. You were the lucky ones. I wasn't adopted. I was picked up by a military academy in Galbadia that I hated. I was one of the first ones to transfer into Galbadia Garden because I hated that place so much. I can't believe I was there too.
Zell shivered a bit from the weight of the realization. The remembrance.
Yo, come on. Stop it. Matwin, help. Cry baby Zel.
Zell frowned at the new voice in his mind. The familiar voice. The one that made him want to irrationally punch something.
Who was that?
He asked.
There was someone else. Na.
That smug face. That insufferable attitude.
Stop teasing me, Cypher. Ah.
Zell drew back.
Oh, my goodness.
Quistis gasped as though the memory had hit her at the same time.
Cypher.
Selfie gasped along with her. That's right. Cypher.
Cypher.
Zell growled, clenching his fist in rage.
My archenemy. Wow.
Selfie laughed, ecstatic now.
He was there, too.
The others laughing. The others playing. The old stone house that was the only life he had ever known in his, admittedly, short existence. Standing back. Refusing to engage anymore. Because it was just so much safer to be alone and distant.
Cypher was there,
Irvine nodded.
Except for Renoa, we were all there.
All of them. Selfie gasped, turning quickly.
Hey. Then that means.
Squall's arms were crossed, his eyes downcast. The past was beating at him now, coming faster and faster the more he recalled. Hiding at the top of the stairs while everyone else played with fireworks and then being spared punishment because of it. Watching the lighthouse turn from outside while the others played inside. Standing apart. Never wanting to play with them anymore. And there were so many of them. No one noticed or cared about little Squall hiding in the corners, in the shadows. He couldn't handle the loneliness anymore, but he couldn't risk getting close either.
Yeah.
Squall breathed, uncrossing his arms and standing straight to face them, to face his past, head on.
I was there, too. Sis.
Squall frowned at the images of his dreams. The water. The rain. The wanting. The only person there that had treated Squall like he was special. Like he was more than just another parentless baby dumped on the doorsteps of that old stone house. The others, at least, had memories of loving parents and warm homes. Squall had been too young when he had arrived. He knew nothing else but the stone house and that one girl who truly loved him.
I was always waiting for her to come back,
he admitted.
For sis. I'm all alone. But I'm doing my best. I'll be okay without you, sis. I'll be able to take care of myself.
He hadn't turned out okay at all, Squall realized. Back then, when she had still been there, he had been able to play and laugh with the others. Her disappearance had ripped something from him. Something that he continued to miss to this day.
Sis.
Quistis frowned, struggling to recall.
I think I remember her. Sis.
Selfie bit her lip.
Yeah. She was bigger than me. Than all of us. Sis. L.
Squall repeated dully. He knew that nickname.
I would hate to think I was forgotten. Elone.
He finished, his voice hollow. So he had known her. He had been waiting for her. And when she had finally come back, he couldn't even recall her name. Once the most important person in his world, the only thing that kept him connected, and he had begged her not to count on him.
Elone.
Zell repeated, confused.
Elone was sis.
Squall looked up at the others.
She was a bit older than us, and we all used to call her sis. Because you called her sis,
Irvine pointed out.
You were there before me, Squall, and I was one of the first of us to arrive. You called her sis, so we all called her sis. So, you have a blood sister?
Selfie asked, smiling.
I don't think so.
Irvine shook his head, frowning.
How do you know?
Squall asked.
Well, for one thing, you two look nothing alike. For another, if you two were from the same family, why wouldn't you have stayed together? I don't know what happened to Elone. I just remember waking up one day and she was gone. And you, Squall? Yeah.
Squall looked away. He couldn't deny it, not to Irvine. Not right now. He had changed when Elone left.
If you were related, wouldn't you be with her?
Irvine asked.
You were left behind. I don't know what happened to you in the end. You were the first to arrive, Squall, and you were the last to leave. No one knows where you went or why.
Squall wasn't entirely sure either. He had very little control of the memories that were racing back to the forefront of his mind.
So, sis is Elone.
Zell frowned, trying to put his mind around that. To bring into clearer focus the fuzzy memories of the pixie-faced girl just a little older than them.
She's the one that takes us back to Laguna's period,
Selfie said thoughtfully.
She told me she wanted to change the past. I don't know why.
Squall said.
Well, there can only be one reason for that,
Quistis pointed out. Selfie gasped.
She must not be happy with the present. If that's the case, I'm definitely up for helping her.
Zell declared.
She's part of our orphanage gang. You didn't even remember who she was.
Selfie put her hands to her hips.
Hey, Selfie,
Irvine gave her a look.
That goes for you, too. Of us all, I am the only one allowed to be derisively mocking about the past. Admittedly, I didn't really know much about Elone though. She didn't talk much about where she was from. Everyone was fond of her though. But you, Squall, you kept hogging her for yourself. She doted on you pretty hard too, though, now that I think about it. You two might well have been real siblings. You sure have a good memory.
Squall crossed his arms. He shook his head.
This is really strange. I doubt highly that I was adopted because of the way I am. Probably the same with Cypher, too. We must have been at Garden by the age of 5 or so. Even so, he's never mentioned anything about growing up in an orphanage. And nothing about this has ever crossed my mind when I see him, either. Don't you find that odd? That is strange,
Selfie agreed, nodding sagely.
In my case, I had loads and loads of fun when I left my new family to go to Trebia Garden. That's probably why I forgot all about my childhood. That's what I think. But I don't know what's up with you guys. It's so odd that all of you would forget. I think I remember,
Quistis breathed, shaking her head as though to jostle the memories back into place.
Yes, I remember now. Things didn't work out too well at my new home in Galbadia. I ran away and jumped a train to Balam. I enrolled myself in Garden at the age of 10. That was when I first noticed Cypher and Squall. Cypher and Squall were always fighting. Yeah. Quistis always used to break us up.
Honestly, not much difference between the years.
Yes, that's right.
Quistis nodded, looking at him with a wide smile as it all came back to her in a rush.
Cypher was a punk little kid who always needed to be the center of attention. But Squall always used to ignore him. And, eventually, they would end up fighting. You could have easily walked away from it, but you always took up the challenge. You should have just ignored him. But, every time, almost in tears, you would say, I gotta do my best by myself. Or else I won't be able to see sis.
Quistis let out a long breath as so much about Squall finally clicked into place. For both of them. His taciturn personality, his determination to be alone, his inability to turn down a challenge. He had been trying to prove himself. To earn back the love of someone he thought had deserted him. And, as his memories faded, only that feeling remained.
I guess.
Quistis sighed, staring at the ground as she looked back on her life.
I was trying to take Elon's place. To give Squall something back he had lost from our childhood. To no avail.
And, just like Squall, as her childhood memories faded, it left only the feeling behind. The feeling of hoping he would turn to smile at her. The feeling of wanting to be there for him. To provide him someone strong to depend on. To confide in.
That's probably it.
She gasped as details about herself also clicked.
Even after becoming an instructor, even when I had forgotten, I couldn't stop thinking about Squall. I thought it was love. I thought I had to hide my feelings because I was an instructor, but it wasn't. It was my childhood feelings as an adopted sister that lingered.
Quistis's shoulders dropped as it all suddenly made sense. The obsession. The favoritism. The knowing she was doing something wrong but being unable to stop. It wasn't because she had a love she couldn't control, it was because Squall was family. The people she had run away from had been abusive and manipulative, more emotionally than physically. So when she had arrived at Garden, those orphanage kids had still very much been her family. And that's what she had been feeling. Familial love. The realization was both a relief and somewhat of a letdown. She hadn't been in love after all.
Oh, well.
She shrugged. Then, mostly to herself, she whispered.
Actually, I had completely given up when Rinoa came into the picture.
Squall, standing closest to her, raised an eyebrow at the statement that only he heard, but didn't say anything to confirm or discredit it.
Hey!
Quistis came back up quickly as a new thought occurred to her.
It must be the same for Cypher. I'm sure Cypher has forgotten his childhood, too. But, the feelings, those didn't fade. And whenever he sees Squall, those feelings came bubbling back to the surface again, and... Is that why he's always pickin' fights with Squall?
Zell frowned, tilting his head.
I don't get it. I mean, I get why I hate him. He always used to tease me. But Squall? Squall was always so quiet. What would Cypher have against him? Cypher needed attention, and Squall wouldn't give him any,
Quistis reminded him.
And since Squall always rose to the challenge, Cypher could never be truly better than him. Which made him mad because he always needed to be the best. Right, Squall?
He didn't know. Honestly, he didn't care. He had much bigger bones to pick with Cypher right now than anything about a childhood he barely could recall. And he had a more important problem at the moment that was bothering him more.
Why is it that we forgot? We grew up together. Yeah, we were kids, but we weren't that young. And we were together for years before we split up. Why did we all just forget? I didn't,
Irvine reminded him gently.
Want my theory? How about this, the price we pay for using the GF? The GF provide us with their power, but in return, the GF make their own place inside our brain. That's common knowledge. And all of us have at least one right now. I have two crammed into one that argue like, well, siblings. They make a home in our brains. They experience the world as we do. And, in return, they take something from us. Wait,
Quistis shook her head, grinning in disbelief.
You're saying that the GF are somehow erasing our memories prematurely? That they're somehow dangerous to us? Well, I wouldn't say erase. We obviously still have them, we just can't remember them easily any longer. And I would say the proof speaks for itself. No,
Quistis shook her head simply.
No, absolutely not. That's just a rumor that the GF critics are spreading. It's totally baseless. And how would we know if it was?
Irvine countered, with a grin.
We remember things when we need to, or when we're reminded. So it's not like we're truly losing something permanently. It doesn't affect our lives in the slightest because they're memories we don't need access to all that often. We're only losing our past in exchange. So if we keep relying on the GF,
Zell frowned,
we won't be able to remember a lot of things. We'll forget even things that are important to us. No,
Quistis snapped, almost angry.
There's no way Headmaster Sid would allow such a dangerous thing. Then how is it that I remember while everyone else forgot?
Irvine countered easily.
Well, I'm from Galbadia Garden, we didn't use GF there. They use SDR technology to stock spells, so they always felt that using GF would weaken us and we were told not to junction them. I had never junctioned a GF until we picked up the brothers in the Tomb of the Unknown King. In Balam, correct me if I'm wrong, but don't y'all start training as soon as you become upperclassmen? You start on theory in grade school. You learn GF junctioning right alongside basic math and language skills.
Quistis's mouth moved as she tried to find a way to refute that. She turned quickly.
How about you, Selfie? Your first experience with GF was when you came to Balam Garden, right? Yeah.
The others all focused on her. On the obviously uncertain statement. They stared at her and Selfie beamed at them innocently.
Okay, I have a confession to make. When I was 12, I went on an outdoor training session. I found a GF inside one of the monsters I defeated. I junctioned that GF for a while without permission. So I kind of have experience with GF, too. At least until it was confiscated when they found out. But, it's really weird. I can't remember that GF's name.
Quistis sighed as the final piece of evidence convinced her.
Then it really must be the GF's fault. So, what should we do? What should we do?
Squall repeated like it was a stupid question.
Nothing. What do you mean nothing?
Zell looked shocked. Squall gave him a cool look.
What do you want to do? You wanna stop using GF now? No. As long as we continue fighting, we're indebted to the powers of our GF. Powers that make us much stronger, faster, tougher than the average person. Our magic, our affinities, our elemental mastery. If there's a price I have to pay for that, I'll gladly pay it.
In his head, he could feel Shiva grow just a bit colder. Her style of a warm blush of happiness in anyone else.
Oh, hey, I have an idea.
Selfie giggled.
Let's all keep a diary. That way we'll always have something to remind us of what we've forgotten. Or a journal, I guess, for you manly types.
Squall nodded, admitting that would probably be helpful. Of course, he had no idea how to write a journal, but the reminders wouldn't be a bad thing.
Are you sure that's what you want?
Zell looked between them all. And he considered the fact that he'd have to give up Ifrit. He'd have to feel cold again. He'd have to give up that heady rush of power and invincibility that came with anger. It would only cost his past. Zell sighed as he made the decision.
Maybe. That's for the best then. Yeah. I guess I don't really care if I forget about my childhood, when Cypher used to pick on me.
His back straightened again and his fist closed in determination.
What's important to me now is having the power to protect my parents in Balam. They adopted me. They raised and loved me as their own. And I love them just as much. If I didn't have Ifrit, I couldn't have liberated Balam for them. There's no way I'm letting go of that power.
The others nodded, agreed with the sentiment if not the circumstances. They fell silent for a moment as they continued to remember their pasts. As they, in a way, bid farewell to memories they might never get to experience again. The stone house. The beach. The lighthouse. The laughter. The tears. The years.
Hey.
Quistis frowned.
Do you all remember Matron? Matwin. Yeah,
Zell grinned wryly.
She was always wearing black. Let me think.
Selfie tilted her head as she sifted through her foggy memories. Irvine stared between them all. Waiting.
Very kind.
Quistis smiled.
Long black hair. Yes, I really admired her.
Selfie frowned first.
Wait, I know her face. I've seen her somewhere before.
Zell shook his head, like he was trying to shake his memories back into sense.
No. That can't be. They look just alike. Look alike?
Irvine repeated. He shook his head sadly.
Nah, that's not it. Matron's name was Edia Kramer. Our matron is Sorceress Edia. Matron. Sorceress Edia.
Selfie closed her eyes tightly, trying to reconcile what her memory insisted was a loving, kind, sweet woman with the sorceress that had killed so many of her friends.
No, that's can't.
Quistis trailed off, unable to deny what she knew was truth.
Why? Why would she?
Irvine looked between them as they all began to recall the love and joy they had felt under the tender care of the unbelievably kind Edia Kramer.
You're wondering why Matron would take over a country or fire missiles and whatnot? Are sorceresses really inherently bad? Is the power really corrupting? Or did she just have us all fooled? At this point, we probably wouldn't comprehend it even if we talked about it for the rest of the night.
Squall's arms crossed, agreeing with him silently. More things that just didn't make sense.
Guys, I didn't bring this up for no reason,
Irvine said, getting their attention again.
I just want you to hear me out. Seed and garden were all Matron's idea, right? I'm not a seed, but I want to be. And I share the same feelings, the same past, with you. Garden will train seeds. Seeds will defeat the sorceress. Right.
Squall nodded, agreeing. Yet another thing that didn't make sense. Because if Sorceress Edia was Edia Kramer, Headmaster Sid's wife and matron to a group of helpless orphans, then she was the same one who thought of seed and garden. So, if that were true, why order Cypher to torture Squall for information about what they were? She would know better than anyone.
So this is what I wanted to say.
Irvine straightened his back and looked them all in the eyes determinedly.
I understand what Rinoa is saying. I get that fear that you'll lose something important to you. Despite the time that's come between us, you all are still my family. And that's just as true for Matron. For the woman who took me in when war destroyed my hometown. I understand. But I'm still gonna fight. I wanna stay true to everything I've stood for. To the past that brought me here. And I'm sure it's true for all of you. That's why I thought it would be best if everyone knew we would have to face our matron. I didn't want to be the only one who knew we were facing our own past. You've all heard it said before, life has infinite possibilities. I don't believe that one bit. There weren't many paths for me to choose. Sometimes, there would only be one. From the limited possibilities I faced, the choices I made have brought me this far. That's why I value the path I chose. I want to hold true to the path that had to be taken. I know our opponent is Matron, whom we all love very much. She raised us, she gave us a home when we had nothing else. She protected us, provided for us, and sheltered us. But this is one of those times when I have few choices. And facing Matron, facing my past, is the easiest one I've had to make. It's true, we might lose something very important on account of the GF. But I don't mind. It's not like I drifted here on the tides of fate. I was reunited with you all by chance. But when General Caraway needed Rinoa out of the prison, I volunteered, because I knew it would bring me back to you all. I figured Squall would need to come to me to get her back. And when that happened, we could work out the past and the future. I chose that. And I choose this. Because, more than anything else, we all grew up together. We're family. But due to various circumstances, we all separated. Spread out across the world. Despite that, here we all are now. Back together and much more our own people than we were. As a kid, you can't really go out on your own. There are no other paths to take. All I could do then was just cry. Then grow. And get stronger. And now, somehow, we're all together again. Just like old times, though a lot has changed. We're not kids anymore. We're strong enough to take care of ourselves. To make our own decisions. And we're confronting a big one right now. Do we fight Matron, or not? I say we fight. Shoot for a common goal. Hey, at least it'll keep us together a little longer. And I don't know about you, but I have to know. I have to be able to ask. It was a brief few years of my life, but it was a big part regardless. I have to face this. I want you all to be there with me.
Irvine finished with a long breath and they remained silent for a moment, staring at him. Letting the words sink into their minds, into their hearts. Zell broke it first. He nodded, smiling slightly.
Yeah. Let's do it. We can't run from her for the rest our lives. She's already after us anyway. It's just such a bummer,
Selfie kicked at a loose stone.
I can't believe we have to fight Matron.
And now that she remembered who she was, it actually hit her emotionally.
I agree,
Quistis sighed, but straightened her shoulders.
But Zell's right. We can't run from her forever. Rinoa.
She jumped in surprise when Squall called out to her. She had been so focused on everything going around her, that she had kind of forgotten that she was still there. She almost felt like she was watching a drama unfold on a TV. With just her name though, Squall turned everyone back to her and their friendly gazes pulled her back into the circle.
It's your choice now,
he said softly.
We're gonna fight. I think it's the only way we can move on with our lives. If that makes any sense at all, come with us. I'm sure that's what everybody wants.
It's what I want, he thought to himself as the others nodded and smiled eagerly. Rinoa stared at them, her face unreadable, as the first snowflakes started to fall.
Look! Look!
Selfie bounced eagerly, pointing as the fluffy white puffs drifted down around them silently.
A gift from the fairies.
Squall had his head turned up to watch it.
Yo, you wanna go check out Edia's orphanage?
Zell asked eagerly. Irvine shrugged.
Sure. We might find a clue. Clue?
Quistis repeated.
You mean as to why Matron turned out like this?
10 years ago, give or take, Edia had closed her orphanage. She adopted out as many kids as she could and saw to the comfortable placement of the others. Squall could now remember staying there by himself watching as all of his playmates, his friends, his siblings, were taken away. Elon's disappearance followed by everyone leaving him one at a time. Matron had disappeared not long after that. Squall couldn't remember exactly how he had ended up at Garden, but he knew that he had been mostly alone. He had only Cypher as company, and Cypher was not very good company. That loss, one after the other in so short of time, had driven him to what he was now. And marked the moment that Matron had changed. But the past was the past. It was over, done with.
Despite what truth we find, it's not going to change the present. But...
Squall's hard voice softened slightly as he admitted,
I wanna see, too. I don't know what we'll see, but let's try to find Edia's orphanage.
The others all started nodding and talking excitedly. With a new plan, with the truth now burning in their minds, they started walking back towards Garden. Rinoa started to follow them but then stopped under the basketball hoop. Squall walked to her calmly.
I guess that's it,
he shrugged.
We're fighting. You guys are fearless.
Fearless? No, that wasn't quite right. It was more like they didn't want to think too hard. If they did, they would just lose themselves.
I wish we didn't have to fight either, for what it's worth,
he admitted. Rinoa shifted her weight, her face still closed and guarded. They hadn't addressed her fear yet. They knew what she felt, but that didn't change.
I'm scared, Squall,
she breathed.
I'm not going to let you get hurt. And you can defend yourself. I am not worried about me, I'm worried about you.
Me? Squall was taken aback by the admission. Rinoa nodded.
Squall, you almost died the last time you took her on. She's a sorceress. The normal rules of magic don't apply to her. She's so strong. Okay. Then I just get stronger.
Rinoa lifted her head up again, looking Squall in his eyes.
Just like that.
He shrugged.
Sure, why not? Sorceresses are powerful, but they're not invincible. Isn't that why yours needed a knight in the book? You actually read it. I was raised, trained, and crafted to defeat her. So if I'm not ready yet, I just train until I am. How? By killing grats in the training center. No. Well, start by upgrading our magic. Get more powerful spells. We'll train our GFs. We'll train ourselves. We'll work until we're strong enough.
Rinoa looked up, smiling slightly. He agreed easily, almost grinning back at her.
If you feel like you're being left behind, then I'll train you until you catch up.
Rinoa chuckled softly.
Somehow, I knew you would say that.
Squall looked at her, trying to figure her out. Trying to figure himself out. Rinoa smiled brightly at him and reached out to take hold of his hand. She clenched it tightly, firmly.
Just so you know, you're not alone.
Squall's eyebrow raised.
What brought that on? Your childhood.
Rinoa stepped closer and leaned against his shoulder. A place that she had already become comfortable on.
I saw it in your face when you said you were waiting for Elone to come back. I just wanted to tell you. You're not alone. I'm here. The others are all here. Everyone leaves eventually, Rinoa. Didn't you hear that part? Yeah. I also heard the part where everyone came back.
She smiled up at him.
We're not children, Squall. Isn't that what Irvine said? No one can force us apart now if we don't wish it. You said yourself that circumstances change. Yeah. And they can change back. Let's keep walking this path, Squall. I want to see how far it's going to take the two of us.
The corner of Squall's mouth lifted slightly as she started leading him from Trabia Garden. He couldn't lie, he rather liked the way she would take control and not rely on him for everything. When she ordered him around, he didn't have to worry about being leader or making tough choices. That night, after ensuring that all seeds and cadets were back aboard the Garden, Squall sat down at his desk and turned on the small lamp there. He placed the black leather-bound journal he had bought from the library supply store down and picked up his pen. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. He had taken a peek at Selfie's public diary, but he doubted highly he could replicate that kind of thing. It just wasn't in him to get into emotions and joyfully and sorrowfully proclaim the events of the day. What was like him, however? Squall put his pen to the top of the paper and wrote the day's date. Then, like he was penning a formal report for the headmaster, Squall wrote down the events of the day, implications thereof, important thoughts, plans, and the current general status of himself and his team. It took a long time to write that first journal entry, but when he reached the bottom he finished it with the simple statement Rinoa had given him. He wanted to walk with her down this path as well, to see where it would take him, because he couldn't seem to stay away from her long enough to find out what it would be like without her. End of chapter.